For a long time now, one of the first things I do in the morning before I rush downstairs and make Sarah her cup of tea and pander to all her needs, but one of the first things I do is I've got into this habit of reciting the Lord's Prayer. And I've been particularly focused on for a while now, give us this day our daily bread. And it's an amazing how many times of late that has been my testimony, that something has happened that day that has met a specific need. And there's something about our daily bread being met on a daily basis and God not giving us everything that we're ever going to need forever in one go, but there's something about He meets our daily bread on a daily basis that is teaching me something about learning how good He is and how He doesn't let me down on a consistent basis. That makes sense? Nothing at all to do with what we're going to be looking at this morning, but just that last few minutes of worship, it just came back to me. And I think it's important to acknowledge sometimes, isn't it, that He never lets us down. We're going to look at the subject of shame this morning. And it's something that I've felt God's been speaking to me about for a number of weeks now. And for those of you who have ever done the Kintsugi Hope course, you'll know that shame is one of the topics for one of the weeks. And for anyone that has done the Kintsugi course Hope, you'll also know that one of the golden rules, the golden rule, is what happens or what is said in the room stays in the room. So I'm not going to talk about what happens in the course this morning, but I do want us to look at one of the... Sarah's worried. Oh, look at that. She's looking after me now. Look at that, huh? It is a two-way street. She's worried I'm going to trip and fall, which would not be fun just before I go on holiday. So we're going to look at this topic of shame this morning. And when the course that I've been doing, the Kintsugi course, it was the week, I think, the shame week, if we can call it that, is the one that really kind of stood out to me and probably impacted me the most. And since then, it's one of these things I felt God's been speaking to me about fairly consistently. And it's come up in the most random of scenarios. It came up at to the Highland Business Dinner a few weeks ago. It's been part of the story which we've been looking at in our life group for the last few weeks now, which we'll look at shortly. It came up last Sunday when Sarah and I had the privilege of speaking at Inverness Vineyard. It came up through a song that Helen wrote and shared at Wild Goose last Sunday night. And then it came up again through a verse that Andrew shared at Men's Fitness as part of our Words of Wisdom. And when you get a run of things like that happening, either that's the biggest coincidence ever, or I think God's trying to get my attention, and this is something that we need to look at this morning. But Patrick Regan, who wrote the Kintsugi course Hope, has just released fairly recently a book called Brighter Days. And each chapter effectively is one of the weeks on the course. And I'm in no commission for mentioning this, but I found this book really helpful. If you have it as an audio book, it's a dead easy listen. It's only about 4 hours and 47 minutes, which for an audiobook is quite short. It's a very easy read if you want to read it, and I would highly recommend it. But in the chapter where it looks at this subject of shame, he starts off by talking about the difference between guilt and shame, which is quite important for us to look at before we get into our story. Because guilt says, I did something wrong. Shame says, I am wrong. We can feel guilty about actions or behavior, but still believe we're a good person. Shame makes us feel like we're worthless and undeserving. Guilt can actually be a healthy thing in our lives if it motivates us to change how we behave and make amendments for the way that we've acted. But shame is the opposite and is extremely toxic and serves actual no purpose or no benefit. Patrick talks about two types of shame, external and internal. External shame, our perception of what people think about us, which is often not the reality or based on any facts. And then we have internal shame, the way that we perceive ourselves. And this bit in the book I thought was just brilliant. But in the story of our life, each of us has an opportunity to rewrite our ending. But in the story of our life, each of us has an opportunity to rewrite our ending. And after overcoming shame in his life, I think that's what the character in our main story today does. Because our main character is a guy called Moses. And there's a key verse that we're going to focus on today. Exodus 2:12. After looking in all directions to make sure no one was watching, Moses killed the Egyptian and hid the body in the sand. Now, if you're familiar with the story of Moses, then you'll know that Moses' story begins following the story of Exodus, which follows the story of Joseph, who after guiding Egypt through 7 years of feast, 7 years of famine, moves his family to Egypt. 4 generations go by, which they reckon would be about 250 years. And now the Israelites have multiplied into a nation of their own. A new king or new Pharaoh who knows nothing at all about Joseph in the story comes to power, and he's concerned about the amount and influence of the Israelites. So he brings them into slavery. Then Pharaoh takes an even more severe action. Pharaoh orders all the midwives to kill all the male-born babies. Now the midwives, though, they refuse. And they tell a wee white lie to Pharaoh because they fear God. Then Pharaoh tells everyone to throw every newborn baby into the Nile. So Moses' mother hides him when he's born and then hides him in a basket in the reeds of the Nile. Then Pharaoh's daughter spots the basket and has compassion on Moses. Moses is taken to live in the palace at the suggestion of Moses' sister, who just happens to be passing by. And she also suggests to Pharaoh's daughter that an Israelite woman would be the best person to look after this abandoned little boy. And guess what? Moses' mum just happens to be walking past and offers to do it. Quite a clever, well-executed plan to help save and preserve the life of Moses. Moses then lives probably quite comfortably in the palace for many years until verse 11 in chapter 2. Many years later, when Moses had grown up, he went out to visit his own people, the Hebrews, and they saw how hard they were forced to work. During his visit, he saw an Egyptian beating one of his fellow Hebrews. After looking in all directions to make sure no one was watching, Moses killed the Egyptian and hid the body in the sand. The next day, when Moses went out to visit his people again, he saw 2 Hebrew men fighting. "Why are you beating up your friend?" Moses said to the one who had started the fight. The man replied, "Who appointed you to be our prince and judge? Are you going to kill me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday?" Then Moses was afraid, thinking, "Everybody knows what I did." The book of Exodus is probably one of my favorite books in the whole Bible. But out of the 40 chapters in Exodus, only about 4 cover the first 80 years of Moses' 120 years on earth. The other 36 chapters, along with 27 chapters of Leviticus, 36 chapters of Numbers, 34 chapters of Deuteronomy, a total of 133 chapters cover the last 40 years of his life. And it's very easy then to skip past this very important but major incident in his life. And whenever I've always read that in the past, I've always felt that seems quite an extreme reaction by Moses to kill this Egyptian. There's nothing in this to suggest that Moses knows this person or it's a family member. So what would compel him to do that? Because as horrible as it would have been to see somebody getting beaten by a slave driver, it was probably in all reality a fairly regular occurrence. So why did it get such a reaction? Now, I'm going to make quite a few assumptions as we kind of think about this story. But if Moses had been born today, I think we'd be looking at this story through quite a different lens. I think we'd be talking a lot more about his childhood trauma. I think we'd be much more focused on the fact that his parents had to give him up in order for him to be saved. Imagine how confusing that would have been for a young Moses growing up, and based on what we've just read, he must have known about where he came from. He must have been fully aware about the fact that other boys his age were killed, yet he was allowed to live. I don't know if you've ever heard of something called survivor's guilt, but according to the National Institute of Health, it's defined as survivor's guilt is the response to an event that some people experience when they suffer a traumatic event or situation that others did not. This psychological phenomenon can be associated with post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety disorders, and complicated grief. Now remember, I'm making some assumptions here and trying to look at this story through a 2024 lens. But I wonder how much Moses was affected by all this. I wonder how the shame that he had to wrestle with affected him, knowing that not only did he survive when other boys his age didn't, he then gets to go and live a life of privilege in a palace, while knowing that his family and fellow Israelites are suffering ever-increasing hardships. I wonder how much he was affected by that external shame, the perceptions that he thought other people had of him, that he was in a position that he didn't deserve to be in. Would people view him as one of their own, or would they view him as a traitor? He's gone off to be with the Egyptians and abandoned his own people. I wonder how much he was affected by that internal shame, what he perceived of himself. Am I letting my friends and my family and my relations and other people down by the fact that I'm just continuing to live in this palace? And I wonder if this melting pot of trauma, of emotions, of guilt and shame were all a massive factor in what happened that day when he came across that fellow Israelite being beaten, and he simply snapped. And as I said before, in this story of Moses' life, this is like a few lines out of 137 chapters, which, by the way, there's not many people in the Bible that have 137 chapters written about them. But this is the man who would one day receive the 10 Commandments directly through God, which includes, thou shalt not murder, exactly what he has just done. Now, we don't know who the person was who he killed, but it's quite possibly he was a husband and a father who went to work that day and never came home. And Moses now has to live with that guilt and shame forever. One person's trauma transferred onto another family. And then we see Moses' reaction to all this when that guilt and external shame starts to kick in. And we can only assume for Moses that the guilt element was probably a healthy thing for him, because there's no evidence of him being violent again. But we see this thing around external shame because Moses was afraid, thinking, everyone knows what I did. What are their perceptions of me going to be now? Now, probably none of us have ever done what Moses did in that story. I wonder how much of this story we can actually start to relate to. Because of something that we've done in the past, we end up with the toxic effects of shame. We end up believing that I am wrong, that I am worthless, and I am undeserving. And what Moses did in this situation was to run away. Now, yes, if he'd hung about Egypt, there was more than a strong probability that Pharaoh would have got hold of him and probably killed him. But what does running away look like in our situations when we're dealing with shame? It might not look like running to a different geographical location, but it can look like running and hiding from the help and hiding from the people who love and care us, that actually want to help. Scholars reckon Moses was about 40 when this incident happened. He then spends about 40 years in the wilderness before he then spends another 40 years in a different wilderness for different reasons. But 40 years away from his family, his home, feeling he could never return because of what he's done. And I said at the beginning, I felt that God's been speaking to me about this for a while. And through my day job, other day job, I quite often get asked to go to the Highland Business Dinner once a year, which is not exactly a hardship, so I normally say yes. And this year's Highland Business Dinner actually coincided with the end of this year's Mental Health Awareness Week. And a guy called Colin Marr is the new Chief Executive of the Chamber of Commerce who organises this whole dinner. And he introduced this year's speaker, which is a guy called Alistair Campbell. You may remember his name. He used to be Tony Blair's spin doctor when he came to power back in 97, I think it was. He's now a political commentator, but he's also a mental health campaigner after his own challenges around mental health. Colin then told this room of 350 odd business leaders and politicians about how twice he's had to seek help from the NHS for his own anxiety. Alistair then goes on to tell some of his story about how he had to overcome shame and embarrassment. He said in the highly competitive world of politics, he assumed that some of his main rivals, the right-wing press, would just hound him and just be on him as a weak person. But actually, some of those that he would have described as his rivals were the people that were of most support to him. And one of the conclusions I've come to is, in reality, very few people, when they see someone in trouble, will actually walk on by and not offer to help. But our external shame, that perceptions we build up in our head, try to tell us something different. And as I listened to these two guys share their stories in an incredibly public way, you could feel the atmosphere in the room change. The conversations around the table as the meals were served was really interesting. And I'm fairly sure that every single person in that room would have left feeling more able and more confident about sharing their own mental health challenges because of the bravery of those two guys. And there's real benefits to actually acknowledging our challenges and our failures. In Luke 8:17, Jesus says, "For all that is secret will eventually be brought into the open, and everything that is concealed will be brought into light and made known to all." And often the more that we try and hide things, I think the more likely those things will actually be to come into the light. And in my limited experience of dealing with people with addictions, that is absolutely true. So as and when we struggle, finding people who can actually help us to bring things into the light in a positive and supported way is massively beneficial for us. But like the two guys at the dinner, your bravery can often be an inspiration to others. When you might feel that shame about your situation, but it might just be that your situation and your story is the catalyst for someone else to then go and get help. But our external and internal shame are perceptions about what others might think or say about us. And we get this thought into our head, but I'll be judged. What will they think about me? No, why would anyone want to help me? All these things start to come to mind. Alistair then went on to talk about another quite well-known politician from not a million miles from here who died an alcoholic. And he said he was ashamed to admit his drink problem, even though everybody in Parliament knew about it and had offered to try and help him. But that battle with external and internal shame was just too great. But what we see with the story of Moses is that's not how God reacts to us. That perception about judgment and being rejected, it's just not true in this story. Because one day when Moses was tending the flock of his father-in-law, having married, and was now living in the land of Midian, it tells us that God appeared to him in a burning bush and called him to lead the nation of Israel. And this part of the story reminds me of something we looked at a few weeks ago when we looked at the parable of the lost sheep. And in the parable of the lost sheep, we talked about the fact that the shepherd leaves the 99 to go and find the one. And that is what's happening here. God running after Moses to find him in the wilderness where he was. You know, Moses' reaction for most of chapter 3 and 4 of Exodus is, God, you must have made a mistake. You can't possibly want me. I'm of no worth. I'm of no value. You need to go and ask somebody else to do it. And I wonder how much internal shame Moses is still dealing with here. That perception that Moses has about himself. Because of what I've done in the past, there's no way God can use me in the future. And I wonder how many of us can relate to that point today. We want to say no to God because we believe the lie that we're not good enough for him to use us in some way. So what is God looking for us in us today? And this is a couple of verses that Andrew bought on Monday night, Psalm 51, 16 and 17. You do not desire a sacrifice, or I would offer one. You do not want a burnt offering. The sacrifice you desire is a broken spirit. You will not reject a broken and repentant heart, O God. If you've never heard that term kintsugi, which I said at the beginning, it's the Japanese art form of making something beautiful out of something that was broken. So if you break a plate, rather than throwing it in the bin, they'll put gold in the glue and make it all quite unique and special. But for me, that's what these verses are talking about. It's what the whole story that we've been looking at around that bit of Moses' life is about. A broken but repentant spirit that God turned into something incredible. God effectively kintsugi'd Moses, if I can put it that way. And then on Sunday night, we're at Wild Goose, and Helen brought a song based on Psalm 113. And the bridge of it said this: He reached out, he rescued us, raised us up, and brushed off the dirt. He took our place, he carried our shame, that we might be called by his name. He placed us in his song, and now we are seated with kings. I just love that. I love that image there of, it's a bit like Moses. You can imagine him, he's out in the wilderness, he'd be covered in dust and dirt and all that kind of stuff, weighed down by the shame and guilt of what's happened. And there's God in the burning bush, reaching him up, brushing off all that dirt and dust and saying, come on, I've got a job for you. And like when God met Moses in the wilderness, like with the parable of the lost sheep, he is reaching out to every single one of us today. Are we ready? Are you ready for God to rewrite your ending today? When we were at Vineyard last week, the lady that was leading the meeting, and she mentioned that she'd been in a I can't even remember what shop it was, but there was a Travis song playing. And pretty much every shop you go into, there's a lot of Scottish bands getting played at the moment because of football and the Euros. And I don't know if this would be seen as Travis's most famous song, Why Did It Rain on Me? You know that? No. Michelle's going to sing it for all of us. But there's a line in there, why does it always rain on me? Was it because I lied when I was 17? And I think one of the things that shame does is it convinces us that our past will determine our future. Because I did X at 17, I've been written off for the rest of my life. And I go back to the fact that out of 137 chapters in the Bible relating to Moses' life, only 4 cover the first 80 years. The other 133 years are from the point of the burning bush onwards. These 133 chapters show us God rewriting Moses' ending in a very different way to what he could probably ever imagined. Been taken by God and used in the most incredible and remarkable ways. And yes, if you know the story, Moses still struggled. Yes, he made some more mistakes because he was still human. But when he met God with a broken and repentant heart, God rewrote his ending. And it is no different for every single person here today. God knows our story. He knows the things that we've done in the past. He knows the mistakes that we've made. He knows when we've blown it. He knows the guilt and the shame that we carry. Yet still, he would send Jesus to the cross to make it possible for us to be in that relationship with him. He hasn't written off a single person in this room. Even though at times we're like Moses, we're the one that's trying to distance ourselves, and he's running after us. Whatever your wilderness looks like today, he is running after us. He is leaving the 99 continually and coming after us. I'm going to invite Helen and the band to come back, and we're going to give just a bit of space to reflect on this. But what Sarah and I spoke at last Sunday when we were at Vineyard was the light of the world. And in the very first chapter of Genesis, right at the very beginning of the Bible, what does God do? He declares, "Let there be light." And then what does Jesus say about every single one of us? That we're the light of the world. And it occurred to me that we are the outworking of God's declaration over all of creation when he said, "Let there be light," that light would come through us. Regardless of our past, through our faith in Jesus, he looks down today and he says, "We are the light of the world." That is the promise and the declaration and the truth that we have to believe over ourselves. Not the perceptions, that externally or internally, what we think what other people might think of us, what we think of ourselves. Let's think about what Jesus says about us today. That we are the light of the world. I wonder if we can stand together. Stand, sit, actually. It's just a habit that when you stand. If you feel more comfortable sitting, you're very welcome to sit. You know, when Moses encountered God at the burning bush, it was a one-on-one situation. And I just felt it was important to give everyone the chance this morning to just think about this issue of shame. The things that we've carried from the past, the things that we have believed over ourselves. And as we worship together again, to just you and God, wherever you are, come before him with a repentant and broken heart and say, "God, I'm here. Use me." So we're going to create a little bit of space to do that. If it would be helpful for you to come and have some prayer, then over here, myself and Sarah and Beck and Mark, we're all in that corner. So if it'd be helpful for you to come and have prayer, then we'd love to offer that to you. But let's just take 5 minutes or so just to do some business with God. This is our burning bush moment today, where we can take our guilt and our shame before him. And let's not walk back out the door of it today. Let's leave it at the burning bush once and for all.